under your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 142 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As usual, I'm joined by Mary, a woman whose New Year's resolution is to drink more IPAs and somehow speak more of Oliver Otis Howard. I am merely a poor soul following the rest of the army named Darren. Happy New Year, Mary. How are we doing?
Happy New Year, and Happy New Year to our listeners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to get started again. The weather is balmy as usual here in Pennsylvania, so I'm sure the rest of the country is as well. So everything going okay for you?
Yeah, we already had our first snow day here, which was exciting. I didn't expect to have snow I didn't know if we'd get snow our first winter in Pennsylvania, but here we are.
Yeah, well, here we are. Well, it is a new year. We are starting 2025 off strong, Mary, as once again we are honored to be joined by an author to discuss his new book. Dr. Bennett Parton is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. He got his bachelor's degree at the University of Georgia. Mary, I'm not going to even talk to you about the utter disappointment I had of watching their loss to Notre Dame, but don't get me going about that, okay? Dr. Parton got his master's at Clemson and then got his PhD from Yale University in lovely New Haven, Connecticut. His new book is called Somewhere Towards Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Comes out next week on January 21st, and we are honored to have him join us tonight to talk about it. Welcome, Ben. How are we doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always an honor to have people on here to talk about their passions. No question about that.
Yeah, especially one, like, I've read a couple books about the March to the Sea, and this one just captures like a different story of it, a different perspective, which is nice to see. Something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, which is kind of the emancipation side of Sherman's March.
Yeah, when you think about General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, that Pavlovian response is always about fire and destruction and total war and all the usual stereotypes. But an extremely understudied byproduct of Sherman's March is how the impact of recently freed slaves who saw the general as their savior who would lead them out of those Georgia plantations into freedom. You know, by the time Sherman's army reached Savannah in December of 1864, over 20,000 former slaves who had attached themselves to the army arrived with them. So again, this led to a crisis for the army, but one that would unexpectedly lead to an important part of the post-war Reconstruction. So Ben, I guess a real actual question for you is what about this aspect of it drew you in to the march?
Yeah, so it's kind of ironic, I suppose. I grew up about 20 miles north of Athens, Georgia. And it's funny, I mean, every year of my life, we would road trip from Athens to the coast here in Georgia by Savannah or up into South Carolina near Hilton Head and Fripp Island. And it's funny, I mean, every year, once you get about 30 miles into that trip, you are on the path of Sherman's March. You're going through the same territory that the Army marched through. And now, funny enough, now that I live in Savannah, it's the same route that I take every time I go visit my parents when I go home. And so you just sort of really follow in Sherman's footsteps. But when I was a graduate student, I really had no expectation, I think, that I would write about Sherman or the march. But what really drew me into telling this story or attempting to tell the story is actually reading a work of fiction. I'm sure some of your listeners may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow, the great historical fiction writer, probably best known for Ragtime, which is a great book about the turn of 20th century U.S., America at the turn of the 20th century, I should say. But Doctorow also took on Sherman's March in a book he called simply The March. And it's a wonderful book. And as Doctorow had a habit of doing, he wrote with a kaleidoscopic cast of characters. There's a German-born immigrant surgeon. There's a troubled Southern debutante, two comic veteran prisoners of war. But he also included, as a character in his story, a freed woman by the name of Wilma Jones, who drops everything, follows the army, arrives in Savannah at the rear of Sherman's columns. You later learn, actually, that she is related to another character that figures prominently in another Doctorow book, but I won't spoil that. But the way he described her story, the way he described Savannah, a city that I knew fairly well, as being a city that had just experienced this influx of people that appeared, for all intents and purposes, like a city that became a refugee camp overnight. I suddenly kind of realized that there was many more Wilma Joneses out there, that she was really a composite character for maybe hundreds, thousands of people. And so I kind of set out with a goal to write the story of the hundreds of Wilma Joneses from a historical perspective and not just from historical fiction. And in a sense, really from the beginning of this project, I've always tried to write what in my mind was the kind of nonfiction companion handbook to E.L. Doctorow's fictional The March. And so that is really how the story began. And then in hindsight, the fact that I am from Georgia, that this was a place that is so familiar to me that I can sort of almost imagine the landscape as the march unfolded, just knowing it so well. It later became really important to me. It felt like I was writing sort of a history of my home state in some ways. And so, but nonetheless, the project really started with me just reading fiction.
And then the March to the Sea, which again, not a lot of people talk about how much it directly led to the Freedmen's Bureau and how much that land reform can be traced back directly to the march. It was kind of an unexpected byproduct, but at the end of the day, that's exactly what happens. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating, important part of the story. So let's kind of go back in time to 1864. We're going to use your book as a guide here, right? Now, we've talked many times about the fall of Atlanta, Sherman's desire to march his army to the sea, its details. Mary, you've probably forgotten, but we're not going to talk about all that stuff for now, right? But what we haven't discussed is that what can be called is that tinderbox that was ready to explode within the slave population in Georgia after Atlanta fell. There was a diarist from Louisiana. Her name was Kate Stone. And she described Georgia's rumors of a slave insurrection as if she was living on a torpedo in the countryside. So from a slave owner perspective, we could talk about the real threat of Sherman's army moving through Georgia and its likelihood to spark that tinderbox. And ultimately what it did is change Georgian society, right? And it is common by then, by wherever the army went, slaves followed, right? They said over 500,000 slaves fled to Union lines during the war. And this goes all the way back to Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe, who first declared slaves contraband of war. And by August of 61, that act by Congress to confiscate property used for insurrectionary purposes, that first confiscation act, was in place. But it was only if slaves worked for the Confederacy, right? And, we saw it in Nashville, we saw it in New Orleans, that when these cities fell to Union forces, this happened. But it was really the early establishment of what we're going to talk later, those contraband camps along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, right? And so we could talk about that second Confiscation Act that was passed in July of 1862, which declared any enslaved person who escaped the federal lines to be forever free. This is before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, right? So I guess this is the setup as we go into this, right? The bottom line is these acts encouraged slaves to flee their bondage for federal lines, and the U.S. Army became a symbol of freedom for those in slavery. This is how the mindset of the slave was going into this time. So if you're looking at Sherman, who abided by the Second Confiscation Act by law and law only, is only going to do as laws is going to be what law requires of him. So this is the thing with Sherman. So we could talk here about Sherman, his attitude towards the African Americans at this point, Ben, in how he kind of played along with the Second Confiscation Act.
Yeah, sure. It's a huge topic because Sherman himself is someone who, especially early in the war, was someone who did not see slavery as having a central place in the war at all. In fact, he saw it as being tangential, if anything. The war for him was about preserving the Union. It was a matter of national integrity and nothing else. And he's got wonderful letters to his brother John, who was actually a U.S. senator, who entered the Senate in 1860. He filled Salmon Chase's old seat, basically explaining himself. Him and John are having these wonderful debates about what the nature of the war is about. And Sherman is clear that it is not, to him at least, about slavery. For him, it is a pretext for secession, but secession is the sort of central question of the war. And even as the war evolves, to embrace emancipation, he's someone who resists this evolution at every turn. We see it, especially when he's in Memphis. He served as the military governor. And you're right, he follows the Second Confiscation Act because he has to, but he doesn't like it. And he even puts his own sort of spin on it by refusing to actually declare enslaved people free. He suggests that that's something that only courts can do, that he himself can't do it, despite the fact that by the letter of the law, he can, and that's what he should be doing. And he consistently writes to his brother John, basically taking issue with the nature of the Second Confiscation Act. But at the same time, when he's in Memphis, he also does not return enslaved people to slave owners who are coming to Memphis asking for them to be remanded. This is something that he will not do. So he has a bit of a mixed relationship to the Second Confiscation Act when he's in Memphis. But it's absolutely true that it's the evolution of the government's emancipation policy that I think makes the march such a phenomenon that it is in terms of having so many enslaved people flee to the army. Because it's taking place in 1864. This is well after the Emancipation Proclamation. Enslaved people in Georgia know that if they can get to the army, they can find freedom in some capacity. And Sherman, when he's in Georgia, he doesn't necessarily invite enslaved people to run to his lines. In fact, he includes a provision in his campaign orders that instructs his men that enslaved people who come to his lines may be taken along if they can provide work for the army, but that the officer's first responsibility is to his own troops and to their own success. And this order to me is fascinating because there is the condition of labor, right? This is something that Sherman always imagined, that for freed people to find refuge in his lines, they had to be willing and able to work for the army. It's notable, too, to me, because that doesn't really say anything, his order. It's very ambiguous. It doesn't really give his soldiers clear guidance. But it also, I think, assumes that it's going to be he himself and his army that's going to be controlling the nature of emancipation through Georgia. And one of the things that becomes very clear, at least by Milledgeville, which is about the halfway point of the march, is that enslaved people are going to run to the army whether the army wants them there or not. And so what unfolds through Georgia is really this kind of push and pull of enslaved people fleeing to the army, in some cases the army letting them follow, and in some cases not. And it's this kind of constant negotiation taking place. But certainly Sherman was someone who did not want enslaved people following him any more than they already were.
And so you saw kind of a three-leveled sort of stratification with this. You had Sherman, who issued the order. You had his generals, who some followed it to a T. We'll talk about Jefferson C. Davis later on. And then you talk about the foot soldiers, who are way more understanding of the plight of the slave. You know, he didn't, like you said, he didn't believe in offering refuge for the slaves unless they agreed to work for the army. And he prioritized men because of the labor that they could provide that women and children probably could not. Sherman is quoted as saying, "I prefer to keep this a white man's war." And he resisted every opportunity to give the freedmen the rifle as well. He didn't recruit them. He preferred freedmen around his army to bury the dead, to dig latrines, to other that pioneer work, clearing roads and building trenches, because in his mind, he said he could not trust them yet. And that common belief was when the bullets started flying, that they would turn and they would run. And we saw that throughout the war. Sherman even pushed back on Lincoln in August of 1864 when the president kind of said, "Listen, Billy, can you play along here a little bit?" And he basically stood firm and blew him off, and he kicked the can down the road just so he didn't have to do it. So 1864, U.S. Grant's military objective to win the war, wasn't, as we know, wasn't taking cities. It was destroying Confederate armies. And you had the Overland Campaign, Red River, Atlanta, all those different campaigns all going to destroy the Confederates. But when Atlanta fell, Sherman wanted to veer off that plan. He didn't want to attack John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee. He wanted to march to Savannah and eventually link up with Grant in Virginia. And, just kind of rehashing real quick how he got to where he's going to go with the march. But November 4th, 64, Sherman gets his approval from his plan from Lincoln and Grant, the march to the sea. And we're not going to go into details, but he's going to split his army into two wings, 4 parallel army corps. And we'll talk about the general people later on. But he's not going to have much of an obstruction going through Georgia. He's got about 13,000 of Joseph Wheeler's cavalry. He's got the remnants of Hardee's armies, mostly older men and boys. But again, the message from Sherman is forage liberally, do not enter private homes, do not threaten citizens, and only corps commanders was authorized to burn things. But again, He urged restraint versus the poor, but encouraged force against the rich. But again, these men, these soldiers, didn't know the difference between a barn and a plantation. So there's a lot of gray area for what they did. A lot of CYA orders that he was putting in. But again, almost immediately at the beginning of the march, on November 15th of 64, these newly freed slaves began to follow the army, which is the crux of your book. And Sherman was very clear. If contraband was to follow the army, they had to work and help the army. Basically, he was tunnel visioned. My job is to get to Savannah as fast as possible. I simply cannot be slowed down. But what was fascinating about this book, and you touch on it too, was the obvious religious parallels that the slaves saw when they started marching with Sherman.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the ways that enslaved people interpreted what's happening around them. I mean, there's been so many wonderful books written about the culture of enslaved communities in the 19th century U.S., and they will all tell you that one of the cornerstones of the culture of those communities was religion. And certainly it was a form of Christianity that was different from the mainstream white Southern version of Christianity that was, common. It was very different, but nonetheless, it was very powerful in these communities. And so when emancipation begins to unfold, when this whirlwind of a war begins to arrive on their doorstep, it makes sense that religion and religious metaphors and religious stories are the kind of language and ideas that they turn to make sense of the world happening around them. And one of them is the idea of Jubilee, which is this Old Testament idea that refers to a moment of renewal, of universal emancipation. And this becomes kind of one of the metaphors of the march for enslaved people. It appears all throughout the story. And soldiers themselves reference the idea that they are bringing the Jubilee to the enslaved people of Georgia. And you're right to point out that this is a process that happens very early in the march. And one of the things that I was always astounded by was the incredible numbers by which enslaved people followed Sherman. As you mentioned, when he's in Savannah, Sherman, that is, he speculates that as many as 20,000 enslaved people had followed his army. That number is roughly equivalent to the size of Savannah itself, and it's double the size of Atlanta in 1860. So we're talking about a movement the size of a large southern city. And that number alone doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the army and then decided not to follow the army, and the people who ran to the army and then turned back somewhere along the way, right? So that number is in some ways a lowball estimate of the amount of people who attempted to follow the army. So this is really a pretty profound, almost seismic movement of people. You add that with the 60,000 soldiers, and we're talking about a real wave of humanity marching through Georgia.
I can't imagine how it would have looked from the air, if you could have taken a drone up and seen it, like how big it was. And they talk about it in obviously the song Marching Through Georgia, how big it was. But I'd never, until your book, I knew the refugees, the enslaved people were with Sherman, but I never thought wow, the march just seems that much bigger because of them now.
Yeah. And you added the fact that fires are being burned, right? And that people are seeing smoke on the horizon, right? And to your point about what it would have looked like from the air, I mean, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, that mass number of soldiers and wagons and men and enslaved people, it's probably a 95 in New Haven on a Friday afternoon problem.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But again, for the slave, though, go back to the religious aspect, Sherman's army, was their God leading the Israelites out of Egypt in the Old Testament, just as the Old Testament promised. So God's going to return and right the world according to the pledge of the people. So for the slave, Abraham Lincoln was called the Great Messiah. When Sherman's army passed, like you said, they yelled, "The day of Jubilee has arrived." Sherman's army going through Georgia was fulfilling a biblical prophecy that they dreamt about their entire lives, been passed down from generation to generation. So you can only imagine when this happened how it went, especially in your book talks really well about the struggle that they had to make the decision to follow the army. They'd been told by slave owners that the evil Yankees were going to use you as cannon fodder, and they're going to, all these bad things were going to happen if you went with them. they couldn't always take their families with them. So they had to make that hard decision. Do I follow my freedom and leave my family behind? A lot of them did. And fortunately, like many of parts of history, there are enough people who write stuff down so we can talk about it. And your book talks a lot about the quotes of Adjutant General Sherman's personal scribe, Henry Hancock, quite a bit. And anybody who studies Sherman, studies the March, knows Henry Hancock. And he talks a lot about some of the unexpected benefits that the slaves brought to the army, especially intelligence on the Confederate troops. So basically, it transformed slaves into agents, to which some of these slaves basically saved Union lives. Horace H. Carr, he was from the Company F of the 20th Connecticut. Speaking of Connecticut again, right? He's with the Army's left wing, and he talked about how slaves were able to go beyond the pickets and watch out for Confederates. And in one case, he warned them of a large rebel force just a mile away. And he talks about how he knew the Rebs had hidden horses, and he went to take them to them, and they were able to scare off rebel cavalry because they saw the horses, thought it was a much larger force. Yeah. Military intelligence was a very underrated attribute to the slaves in Georgia. But again, this for many of these guys from the West, many of the guys from Connecticut, Indiana, Illinois, and other parts of the country, this is the first time they're seeing and hearing these stories of the slaves. And it's quite a culture shock to imagine how they were and how much they befriended the Union Army.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, his army was made up of Midwesterners, many of whom had not even likely knew nothing of slavery. Maybe they've never been in the South. In fact, there's a large number of German immigrants. There are a number of record collections that I came across that were written in German and in other languages. So they're fresh sort of immigrant groups that are part of this army as well. And they learned very quickly that enslaved people were their tried and true allies. And your point about military intelligence is absolutely true. Sherman himself was known to interview enslaved people for valuable pieces of information. There are numerous stories of soldiers who would have marched into a hostile plantation or would have ran into Confederate cavalry had it not been for enslaved people warning them. There are even better stories of escaped Union prisoners in Columbia, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia, and elsewhere, who, when they know the march is happening, decide to escape from the prisons and often arrive in Union lines with the help of enslaved people acting as their guides. So all through Georgia, enslaved people are really allies to the Army in a way that benefits them and helps them. And one of the things that's been so fun, or what's so fun about writing this book, is that it really made me think differently about what kind of traditional stories of Civil War warfare looks like, right? I mean, we all know the stories of the pitched battles, armies versus armies, the blue and the gray. But when you really dig into these sources, and as I was writing writing this book, it really kind of opened up a much more sort of personal, highly localized, irregular form of warfare in which enslaved people are taking part in this kind of triangular conflict between Confederate cavalry, Union soldiers, enslaved people, and they are absolutely inserting themselves, and in some cases, playing decisive roles in the outcomes of some of these foraging parties. And that was a real interesting, fun thing to do when I was writing this book. And it really made me think differently about just the nature of warfare, the nature of what this war would have looked like to people. And it really opened up a real new perspective for me.
And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about your book too, was kind of that personal side of it, these perspectives that are not getting talked about as much. It gets away from, while the march is military, it is not a battle. You have the Battle of Griswoldville, but the march overall is not a battle. So it's a different side of war. And that's one of the things that, really enjoyed reading, was these stories I'd never heard before, like the one soldier that the enslaved people were able to help him find a different road to avoid the Confederates. Like, those are really, really important stories to tell in the overall story of the Civil War.
Well, I mean, just to add a few other examples of that, I mean, one of the things that Sherman does is he begins to employ freed refugees as pioneers. In some cases, he coerces them and he impresses them into labor, which is a different story. And as pioneers, their principal job in the march was to clear the roads and prepare the roads so the army could march, which creates an image in one's mind in which enslaved people are literally out in front of the army paving the way to Savannah, which is a pretty stark thing for us to think about. Another great example is what happens as the army nears Savannah. This is a place where the plantations are not, and the farms are not nearly as abundant. These are mostly sort of rice fields. It's the coastal plain. It's not the plush fields of middle and central Georgia. They're also running into more rivers and swamps and streams. And there's a real question of whether or not the army might stall out in front of Savannah, whether or not they'll find enough forage to actually feed themselves. And it's enslaved people who teach soldiers how to hull, husk, and produce rice. And they are in some very nervy days at the very end of the march. It's enslaved people in the rice plantations on the upper neck of the Savannah River that's basically sustaining the army, which is another kind of amazing thing to think about. And when we think about the role that enslaved people played in ensuring the army's success.
And I think it was a surprise to all the Union troops, though, was just how much, the enemy of my enemy is my friend concept. John Richards Boyle, the 111th PA from Alpheus Williams' 20th Corps, with the greatest beard in the Civil War, by the way, Alpheus Williams. Get that out there right now. His quote is, "Every black face was the face of a friend. Every black hand was wide open. Every black man's poor cabin was a refuge to a hunted or imperiled Union soldier." So again, they were going through living off the land, but not only that, but they found themselves with a whole different network, to what you said a second ago, knowing the back roads of Georgia to help the Federals avoid Wheeler's cavalry, who always were hovering around the army like flies, taking shots at soldiers that freed slaves. And a lot of that pioneer work you talked about was done in the more they worked to the mind of these freed slaves, the weaker it made the South, according to the soldiers. But again, what happens is as you go, this volume of slaves begins to become an issue. And you mentioned in Milledgeville, the halfway point. This is really when it became really noticed by the troops that this refugee crisis was going to be something more than they originally thought. The men saw that brutal condition of these plantations, of how many of these former slaves, when they got to Howell Cobb's place, the former Speaker of the House and Governor of Georgia. They find 40 starving slaves who were obviously left behind to die by Howell. And it really left an impact on people like Hitchcock. And they really began to understand that economic power of slavery and that institution would have to die to destroy the Confederacy. And once you got beyond Milledgeville, so you guys just talked about, that landscape changed, and that large number of the following slaves that began to slow the army down now was they needed to do what they could to keep them out of the lines. And again, soldiers reported at this point that Negroes by the hundreds are flowing into the lines, just trying to keep up with the army. They said men and women poured into the army like from every single direction. And these guys, they came by foot, they came on carriage, they came on horses and mules. And again, we talked before about that decision to choose freedom over family and safety, how tough that was, knowing that any future retribution by slave owners, if they were caught and sent back, was going to be brutal. So again, you get into the psychology of these people and how brutal it must have been to risk everything to follow a mysterious freedom, which is what they were chasing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, the freedom that they were chasing here was never clearly defined, and there's been some fantastic writing done about the experience of emancipation being one that is uncertain, unstable, unsecure. It's entering into what some historians refer to as a liminal state, right? This is well before there's any sort of asylum laws or rights of citizenship or anything like that. And so the freedom that they are searching for is always ill-defined. But nonetheless, in marching after the army, I think one of the things that they are expecting is space to be able to put what they imagine as the constitutive elements of freedom together. And so you mentioned this decision of, what about my family? Do I march off after the army? And in many cases, the need to stay with family induces people to remain behind. But there are equal numbers of people who recognize that in following the army, that might take them to family that have been lost, right? That they have been split from. And so there are all sorts of calculations being made by enslaved people about what can be gained, what is put at risk in following the army. And I think the fact that 20,000 end up making this decision, I think only speaks to the sort of power of the march in making some of these sort of freedom dreams, right, come true. Really, I think kind of speaks to the power of this moment. This is ultimately what I think fascinated me the most about this book, and what I think I hope want readers to take away from it more than anything, which is this is a moment where freedom is constantly being reconsidered, redefined, conceived of, and changed. Right, people are adapting their notions of what freedom might be in this sort of brief month and a half long military campaign. And so I think one of the things I think I write in the book is that this is a moment of just real robust reimaginings of what freedom could be and the freedom that could be possible once the war ends.
It's this multi-generational dream. Someday freedom is going to come. And when it does, we got to take advantage. In their minds, this was the prophecy. This was the promise that they talked generations about that was going to happen. And the thing about it is, on the Union side, it was clear that many of the soldiers, the grunt, regular foot guys, they sympathized with the slaves. But again, going back to Sherman and the generals, they only cared about keeping the army moving as fast as possible, and constantly reminded the generals that only the able-bodied slaves willing to work could stay with the army. And even though some soldiers personally encouraged slaves to stick around and follow, you can stay with me, you can cook, your wife can do my laundry, blah blah blah. But again, just looking at central Georgia going to the eastern Georgia now, I mean, it's not like there's no 5-lane highways back then. We're talking about country roads. So traffic was like Storrow Drive in Boston on a Friday when they came close to Savannah. I've never been up to Boston before, but it's no picnic on a Friday on Storrow Drive. But the longer that line of slaves was, the more it bogged the army down. I mean, it's just capacity. But again, freedom was that important to these thousands of people that many walked without shoes and without clothes through these swamps and muck for 15 miles per day to keep up with the army. And again, these numbers kept growing as it went. And despite women carrying children being turned away on a daily basis, as Sherman reminded that the army can only be slowed, and only able-bodied slaves again will be allowed to join. Again, the role of turning people away always fell on the soldiers, who did this for the most part reluctantly, if you think about it, because they knew turning slaves away meant they were subject to Joseph Wheeler's prowling cavalry, the 13,000 mounted men. And what's like with any of these Civil War stories, the meat is in the details of the soldiers. It's the stuff they write afterwards. Forget the generals. It's all about the soldiers. Charles D. Kerr, he was an attorney from Illinois. He joined the 16th Illinois as a private after the firing of Fort Sumter. Later after the war, he became a judge. He writes about this. The rebel cavalry followed our column like an avenging nemesis, scourging and killing all Negroes who were suspected of giving comfort to the enemy. Wheeler himself, he writes, by breaking up the camp during the extreme darkness, a great many Negroes were left in our hands, whom we sent back to the owners. And they said he captured about 2,000 people. But again, this is the life and death decisions that these people had to make. And you can see the dichotomy in the problem, in the controversy in the heads of these men, these soldiers. We're told to turn these people away. But if I do, I'm selling them back to slavery or death. So you can see that psychological and even that philosophical decision on the soldier level of what these guys were thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I think most of the soldiers knew, that in turning them away, this was a reality that could happen. And this is one of the difficult things about writing the book, is that there are moments in this book that are filled with jubilation and hope, and really, I think, kind of leave you seeing this as kind of a triumphant experience. But then there are so many other stories that really reiterate and demonstrate just how dark and sometimes catastrophic and how dangerous and how bleak in some cases the outcomes could be. And And you're right. The closer the Army gets to Savannah, there is growing reticence and alarm about the size of the refugee movement behind the Army. Again, the closer you get to Savannah, the closer you get into the coastal plain. You're in pine thickets. You're eventually in cypress swamps. There are more rivers. It is more difficult terrain for the Army to cross. And I have yet to find smoking gun evidence from Sherman ordering an Army-wide sort of scaling back or an Army-wide directive to begin turning people away. And I haven't found a whole lot of qualitative evidence to suggest that this was a sort of coordinated thing amongst the different columns. But there nonetheless is, I think, a pattern and a preponderance of evidence suggesting there was an Army-wide consensus that something had to be done to turn people away. And you're right, Darren, there are so many stories of soldiers who did not like it, who felt really sick to their stomach about doing it, but who nonetheless did it because they were ordered to, or they were worried about their movement. Of course, the real villain of the story is Jeff C. Davis, who is in charge of Sherman's 14th Corps. He has the route that slopes the closest to the Savannah River, which brings him in a terrain that is the most swampy, that's most filled with rivers. And at Buckhead Creek, which is east of Milledgeville, near the town of Sandersville, he makes it a habit to pull up the bridges before the refugees can cross. And he is the only one of Sherman's corps commanders who writes directly to say that he has a real problem with the refugees following his army. But pulling up the bridges becomes his calling card. It's likely that he does this once more after Buckhead Creek. He may even does it again, but then disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek when Wheeler's cavalry do in fact arrive right as they're pulling the bridges, which leads to a horrible incident on the banks of Ebenezer Creek, in which we don't know how many people might have died or been captured and re-enslaved, but we do know it was a horrific event in which enslaved people were killed, enslaved people drowned in the river, and there were families who pulled themselves up on the other side of the bank that were no longer the family units that they had been previously. So we know this was a real dark, villainous moment on the banks of Ebenezer Creek. And it is really, I think, kind of the symbolic example, right, of the effort that some soldiers went to turn free people away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you say the ultimate decision of what to do with these fell on the officers. You had one side of the coin, guys like Absalom Baird, an abolitionist type who took a soft approach, but then there's Jefferson C. Davis, and the thing of Jefferson C. Davis, I mean, I think most people have heard the name. I think most people associate him with, when William Bull Nelson called him a damn puppy and slapped him across the face, and next thing you know, at the Gate Hotel in Louisville, Jefferson C. Davis is going to murder him, and he's going to be arrested but never tried. And I think that's how most people associate that with him. But Davis's men, they considered him that he had the heart of a stone cold killer. He was ardently pro-slavery. For a guy from Indiana, Davis was in charge of, like you said, Sherman's outermost left wing on that march, and that path you said goes right to the closest to the Savannah River, so it's marshy, it's swampy. So that meant that his army regularly needed to place those pontoons over streams to allow the army to cross when necessary. And you mentioned before, he complained to Sherman about the refugees. He wrote, quote, "Useless Negroes are being accumulated to an extent to which would be suicide to a column which must be constantly stripped for battle." He wasn't a fan. He absolutely was not. You mentioned Buckhead Creek, and that was sort of his first introduction. John J. Hoyt, 58th Indiana. He called what he did by pulling up the pontoons at Buckhead a disgrace to American history. Davis ordered the bridges up before the freedmen the slaves could cross, allowing Wheeler's cavalry to get them behind them. Height, and we talked about this before with you, Mary, Davis was not popular among his men.
No.
Height referred to him as a tyrant without one spark of humanity. This is how they describe this guy. And again, and to Ben's point, the pulling up the bridges became Davis's thing. That was his calling card. It happened again at a place called Rocky Comfort Creek. But it was small, so no one really knows about it. They could kind of cross it. But we got to talk about that December 9th, 1864, Ebenezer Creek, because I think when most people think of the March to the Sea, Once they don't think about the fires, because that's what I always think about is the damn fires. Ebenezer Creek is always the next thing they talk about. Again, he's got 14,000 men, followed by 600 freed slaves. Davis is going to quickly order the pontoons down to cross the deep and wide creek and let them go. And again, Davis is going to order one of his aides to turn the line of Negroes away and towards the swamp initially. James A. Connolly is a major of the 123rd Illinois. He knew exactly what was going to come next because of Davis's past. Once the men crossed, Davis ordered the bridges up, basically stranding the slaves on the other side to the mercy of Wheeler's oncoming cavalry. And there's a lot of sad stories you can read about this. Many jump in the water and drown, especially women and children. Just put yourself in that situation to have a baby in your hand, choose to jump into a cold water and potentially drown versus be sent back to slavery. Again, this is the mentality. This is the thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand appreciate is the decisions that they made. Wheeler does arrive, and it's bedlam. There's bullets firing, people jumping in the water, bullets splashing into the water. An Irish journalist named David Conyngham, he described it like it was the crossing of the Red Sea, absent God's protection. He writes, quote, Wheeler's cavalry charged on them, driving them into a dark stream whose current swept mothers away from their children, pulling them under, never to re-emerge. And while this is going on, many of Davis's soldiers are livid and they're disgusted at what they saw. There's stories of them trying to throw logs in, try to save the people, to give the slave a chance. John A. Connolly continues, the idea of 500 or 600 black women, children, and old men thus returned to slavery by such an infernal copperhead as Jefferson C. Davis was entirely too much for my democracy. In his quotes, they go on and on of these men. But the problem is, Connolly wrote to more people than just his wife. He wrote to who? The New York Times about this. And again, Ebenezer Creek now is going to become a lightning rod event for the abolitionists in Massachusetts and the North against Sherman to show what was going on to these former slaves who would rather die than return to slavery, unfortunately, at the hands of William T. Sherman.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just maybe sort of set the scene of Ebenezer Creek. I mean, I think someone who may not be familiar with it or the landscape may hear creek and think of a small stream or body of water. But the reality is that this is really a kind of bayou or arm of the Savannah River. And so there is a strong current that is consistently pulling off of the Savannah. And where the crossing of Ebenezer Creek happened is not far from the Savannah itself. So there is a strong current there. And especially, I mean, it happens almost in December, this time of year, if there's heavy rains and depending on sort of situations, there can be real high water. And so we're not talking, it's called Ebenezer Creek because there is a current, but we should recognize that this is really a much bigger body of water that, depending on the water level, can essentially be a cypress swamp with a really strong current in it. So it is, bigger than a small stream or anything like that. And you're absolutely right, Darren. I mean, this becomes a real political problem for Sherman because eventually word gets out and the narrative is on the rise. Doesn't come close to being anything near as powerful as the narrative Sherman, this triumphant conqueror coming into Savannah. But nonetheless, there are some very important influential interest groups like abolitionists, the anti-slavery movement, who begin to hear these stories of how Sherman engaged with freed people on the march, and Ebenezer Creek becomes a real lightning rod example for them to point to Sherman and say, you did not pursue and uphold your end of the bargain when it came to enforcing emancipation policy. And this becomes a huge issue. And Mary, as an Oliver Otis Howard fan, some of the news stories actually say that Howard had the same number of freed people crossed a similar amount of rivers, though that's probably debatable, but nonetheless didn't do anything like this, right? So they used Howard and his, Christian charity, his own conduct, right, to really present him as a foil to Davis. But this does become a real issue for Sherman. And it's one that he's ultimately going to have to answer for, because when he arrives in Savannah, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, also arrives. The pretext is for him to be there to investigate and to requisition some cotton that's in the city. But he also comes to talk to Sherman about what happened along the march. And at one point, he even pulls out a newspaper, apparently with a story about Ebenezer Creek in it, and basically demands answers. And Sherman doesn't really have very many good answers to give him.
And then even before that, when he does arrive in Savannah, he doesn't let the refugees follow him into the city. He leaves them back at Kings Bridge, which is going to become basically a depot, and it's going to be kind of a lymph node that we're going to talk about later on when we get to Port Royal, as far as how he's going to deal with them. But again, he finds himself in a really, really tough situation with what's going on. And your Sherman, again, your tunnel vision, my job is to get to Savannah as fast as I possibly can. And again, he leaves a lot of these decisions on how to deal with the refugees up to the commanding generals, these subordinates. I mean, you mentioned Howard. He's going to take one tact. Absalom Bayard is going to take another. But unfortunately, when you get someone like Jeff C. Davis, there's an opportunity to do what he wants to do. They're going to take advantage because the letter of the law directed by Sherman is to, unless they can pull the rope, they can't come. And he's going to twist that out a little bit is what's going to happen. And, there's different personalities. I mean, Oliver Otis Howard, he famously, whenever he met a girl at West Point, he would ask, his pickup line was, did you think about God last night? And if the girl came back, yes, then he would consider to pursue her. If not, then he wouldn't call her back. That's a true story. But that's kind of how he was. But I think before we get to the Savannah experiment, I think we have to set the stage a little bit for the Port Royal experiments, for what comes later, so that makes more sense. And I guess what's going on in Port Royal at that point, as far as maybe the year before and the years before, and how that stands with Rufus Saxon, how things are going as the army approaches, as far as what's going to happen later.
Sure. Well, Port Royal is hugely important, in the story of the Civil War. And, folks that may not be familiar with the geography, Port Royal is a port on the South Carolina Sea Islands, is the heart of the South Carolina Lowcountry. It's very close to the town of Beaufort, and it is on the opposite side of the sound from the island of Hilton Head. This is not that far from Savannah. It's an hour by car, maybe even closer by water, depending on where you put in at. And Port Royal is strategically important because it is the deepest deepwater port on the southern coastline. And so if the U.S. Navy can take Port Royal, can use it as a base of operations to then blockade Savannah and Charleston. And when the Navy does take Port Royal, of course, that forces the region's white inhabitants to take flight, leaves behind about 10,000 enslaved people. And this is the impetus for the Port Royal experiment. The influx of Northern agents, missionaries, philanthropists, technocrats, many of whom are from Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and elsewhere. And their job is to administer aid, teach Sunday schools, build schoolhouses, but also convince the freed people to return to the plantations as free laborers, not as enslaved people. So it's meant to hasten this transition from slavery to freedom. It's a hugely important part of the story of the Civil War. And as Sherman's army is marching through Georgia, and as the encroach upon Savannah is happening, Rufus Saxon, who is the military governor of the islands there, his brother is his aide. He is writing saying they can hear the guns coming, and they have real questions of what Sherman's arrival might mean for the islands around Port Royal and for their project. And at this point in time, the project is not going very well. There's deep suspicion on the part of freed people for, just what good the agents are doing there. There had been a series of land sales by which the land had been auctioned off to private buyers, despite the fact that the expectation was that many of the freed people would be given a chance to own the land themselves. So there is real deep suspicions there. And so it is a project that is really on the wane. It is not in the best standing. And when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he makes the decision to transport the refugees to Port Royal. And this really takes the story in a much darker turn and becomes really an unstable variable in the Port Royal experiment, if you don't mind me sort of
Yeah.
using that metaphor there.
Yeah, I mean, this was originally designed truly as an experiment to basically, can freed slaves live in this community independently, to teach them to read, to educate them, to teach them to basically live post-slavery. I know Selman P. Chase from the Secretary of Treasury had a lot to do with this. And they were taught to read. Fun fact: the first book they were taught to read was called "A Phonic Primer and Reader." It was their very first book, Mary. You might want to pick that up, give that a shot, see if you can do it, right? But again, you mentioned before, Port Royal fell under that military jurisdiction of the Department of the South under Rufus Saxon, a fellow Massachusetts guy, Mary, from Greenfield, Mass. But again, to your point, Ben, Sherman knew that Savannah was a temporary stop. He needed a permanent place to put these people. And again, Sherman writes to Henry Halleck when he gets to Savannah, and he says, "My first duty will be to clear the army of surplus Negroes, horses, and mules." Shows you his mindset, by the way. Not for nothing, right? Grant wants him to go to City Point to help build trenches around Petersburg. But again, Rufus Saxon, he's in charge of Port Royal. Now he's worried about the surge in population. He writes to Sherman and basically says, "I can't handle all these men. This is just too many. I don't have the resources to provide shelter for all these people." Sherman says, "You know what? YOLO, we're going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it." And he did sympathize a little bit, but for the most part, he did still take those physical people who could help him. But the women and children and elderly were going to be subjected to this. Now, the workers in Port Royal who'd been there for a couple of years now, they were called Gideonites, was the phrase. It was kind of a derogatory word used against them, but they're mostly abolitionists from Boston, New York. The Bostonians didn't trust the New Yorkers and vice versa, Mary. Some things never change, not for nothing, right? But that's kind of how it is. But again, Port Royal, to your point, Ben, is a hugely important place in American history. It's the education. It's the birth of the USCT, the first South Carolina. And again, this is where General Hunter, David Hunter, kind of went rogue and issued his own Emancipation Proclamation in May of 1862, and Lincoln told him to slow his roll. But again, once emancipation at Port Royal started, it was never going to stop. But the problem was the former slaves saw the work at Port Royal as a paid version of slavery. And even then, the money they were promised was delayed. It was less. Remember, cotton's still king, and they still have to find a way for the economy. But the big issue, and Ben, you kind of alluded to it, was the land ownership issue with this. And this is going to be kind of like the theme that follows all the way through with this, was freedom for a lot of these folks depends on the ability to own their own land. Husbands did not want to work on someone else's schedule. They didn't want their wives working in the fields. They wanted them at home with their families. So land ownership was the thing that they felt was, they didn't want to, there was an issue of, it was the government didn't want to make them think it was a handout, but they felt they were entitled to the land. They wanted them to have to purchase their own land if they wanted to keep it. And that's going to be part of the whole issue that's going to happen with Port Royal as this whole thing kind of unfolds.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a huge, huge issue. And Port Royal has a deeply complicated history. I mean, we could do a whole hour, 2 hour long podcast talking about all the different complications of Port Royal. And I think the biggest one is this contradiction of the idea that this is going to be a project that will transition from slavery to freedom while keeping the plantation as the central unit of production in place. And you're absolutely right. Enslaved people viewed wage work as a modified form of slavery. Wages were often withheld or not as high as promised. Enslaved people themselves didn't see any value in cotton. It only had a market value. It was a commodity. What they wanted to grow instead was sweet potatoes, corn, things that could keep them sustained, right? And that could sustain their families. And then the land issue is the other giant fissure that really divides Port Royal. Enslaved people, free people wanted the land. There was expectation that it would be theirs at some point. This is, in some cases, for them, sort of ancestral places. There's a really great story of a woman who says that she's staying where she is because she wants to be buried in the family cemetery. So this is really important for people. But the problem is, this gets into sort of the nuts and bolts here, is that when the southern landowners leave, the slaveholders, they don't pay their property taxes, and by law, their tax has to go to a public auction. And there is some allowances made to make sure that free people can preemptively buy some of the land. There's land set aside for the project at Port Royal, but twice in two very public land sales, the amount of property there around the islands get chipped away and sold to private owners. And so this really complicates the sense of mission taking place at Port Royal. And so it's this issue of land and labor that really, I think, underscores the complicated nature of this project. Whereas things like teaching, the building of schools, the religious education, these things all go swimmingly, and really is, I think, sort of the positive side, right, of the coin of Port Royal. Whereas the land and labor really shows the sort of complicated nature of what's happening here.
It's how Robert E. Lee loses the Lee Custis house. He doesn't pay his taxes.
Right.
And he wants to pay the taxes, and they won't cash his check because they want the house, and that's kind of what happens. But again, this is kind of what happens is they take all these properties, get foreclosed on for taxes, and they have all these properties, but now they want people to come in, the carpetbaggers going to buy them. But enter Laura Town. She's a teacher from Philly who got a great idea that if Saxon puts Port Royal under federal control as a military exigency, this can stop the sales of the properties want to live on. And it works, sort of. I mean, a large portion of the area was set aside for federal use to allow the Port Royal experiment to continue. I think it was about 75% of the land that was saved. And again, you're going to have a guy, coming in kind of one of those classic twist in his mustache evil dudes named Edward Philbrook. He's a Boston guy, Mary. He probably went to Boston University or Boston College. Not for nothing, okay? But he's a carpetbagger, and he ended up owning a lot of the private land, 11 plantations. And this is going to be a problem for these Gideonites. So when Sherman's army is going to arrive in December of 64, Port Royal is that political tug of war right now, and the morale was very, very low, including the freedmen who have kind of losing faith in these Gideonites now. They protested these northern whites buying the land, primarily Philbrook, because they saw it as an enhanced version of slavery, what was going on with this. And you can imagine Saxton and Philbrook are going to be natural enemies. They cordial to each other in their writings. But Saxon felt that freed slaves had the right to the land and should not be subject to a market condition sale, and blacks wouldn't have the ability to buy it. But again, this is kind of what's going on with this. Within a month, 17,000 had arrived by January on Port Royal too. And so again, you have Savannah, the city's totally changing upon Sherman's arrival, but as is Port Royal. And just imagine, you have these schools for these former slaves are set up in these slave auction houses in Savannah, coming into the wintertime. But again, when you look at everything that's going on, it's a powder keg ready to explode. It's kind of exactly how it is as you head into the January of 65.
Yeah, and I think too, like one of the things I was just thinking of is this is like, I think what is happening at Port Royal is kind of a smaller picture at some of the challenges that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to experience as well. Like except it's on a much wider scale that they're going to be having similar problems.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason that the great book on Port Royal by Willie Rose is called The Rehearsal for Reconstruction, because her argument, this is so much of what happens at Port Royal prefigures what's going to happen across the country with Reconstruction writ large. And I think there's some real truth to that. And you're right, Darren, to refer to it as a powder keg in a sense, because what happens is when Sherman begins transporting the refugees down the Ogeechee River, which is really his kind of access point there up to Port Royal, the influx of so many refugees takes this island experiment that is really riven by contradictions and is struggling in some respects, and really leads to what becomes a serious refugee crisis. As you pointed out, Saxon writes, Sherman tells him not to send the refugees there. They don't have the resources for them, but he does it anyway. And this is where the story really takes a dark turn, because these refugees are inserted these are men and women who had experienced weeks, months on the road, marching behind the army, shorn of any sort of sense of security, perhaps, or needing food, shelter, and they're thrust right back into a longer, prolonged refugee experience. There's a lack of housing at Port Royal. There's not a lack of food initially, but over time, when February comes around and March comes around, there are serious food shortages, which leads to real issues. And there is high rates of sickness that leads to high rates of death. And this is really a kind of classic story of a refugee camp, sort of, in some ways, a very sort of modern story. I think we might imagine coming out of the news on CNN today. And it makes this refugee story of Sherman's March take a really bleak and tragic turn at Port Royal. Go ahead.
I was saying, Sherman has his feet put to the fire himself with this. People like Henry Halleck are saying, dude, you got a political issue that you're dealing with. And he's like, well, I'm not a politician, so it ain't my problem, right?
Yeah.
But again, you have this meeting on January 12th of 1865 at Sherman's headquarters, the Greenhouse in Savannah, where you have 20 black ministers from the city are going to meet with Sherman and Edwin Stanton. People like Garrison Frazier are at this meeting, for people who know the history of it. But again, he's going to be their spokesman, and they want to know what the situation is in Georgia. And again, they keep pressing this concept. We want land for the freed people. It's the only way that they can take care of themselves. They want to be placed on land until they're able to own it. And they felt land ownership was everything for these refugees, and is going to be their key to becoming citizens, to becoming part of local government, and becoming acclimated into the new post-Civil War society. It's a huge meeting because it's the first time in American history where reps from the government are going to meet with an organized group of African Americans. And the thing about this meeting, like so many meetings with the government, it creates that false hope, right? That maybe things are going to be better. Because what does it lead to? On January 16th, Sherman's going to issue Field Order number 15, setting aside 30 miles of land from Charleston to the St. Johns River in Florida to be used exclusively for the homestead of African Americans. Sounds good on paper. 408,000 acres are going to be divided into 40-acre parcels. No whites will be allowed to own them. It's also going to promise families older and broken down mules from the march. And this is going to be, of course, the famous 40 acres and a mule order. And again, Sherman sees this as a military move, a strategic military move. Why? Because now, instead of the refugees following him, he can dump them into this area. So when he moves into North Carolina, he doesn't repeat this. So again, he's thinking very X and O's, black and white militarily. But this order is going to come, that's going to become famous historically for this initiative to kind of throw a sop at these 20 ministers in Savannah.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And this is something that always kind of surprised me, is that I knew this story, but when I began working on the book, I really focused on what was happening in regards to emancipation in Georgia. And when I kind of got to the end, the question of, well, what happened to freed people? What happens when this story transitions to Savannah? And only then did I realize how much of what actually happens in Georgia, this refugee movement, really is the pretext and is the kind of backdrop for the meeting at the Greenhouse on Madison Square here in Savannah, and then later Sherman's Special Field Order 15. But you're absolutely right, Darren. I mean, Sherman sees this as an expedient. He's very clear about that. He sees it as a kind of political move for him, because he recognizes that with some of the bad press that he's getting for what happened at Ebenezer Creek, that he's got to do something to sort of prove himself that he is attentive to the needs of freed people. But it also, I think, serves his interest because he's about to cut into South Carolina. He does not want the refugees continuing to follow him there. So this is really kind of a move that is an expedient and nothing more for Sherman. But for freed people, this is the promise of Jubilee coming to fruition, right? I mean, part of the biblical story of Jubilee is a story of land redistribution and regenerating wealth and of starting over and starting afresh. And this is really a moment of incredible hope. But there are equal numbers of free people who are also very suspicious, right? They recognize that Sherman only grants possessory claims, not full legal claims to the land. And so there is a hefty degree of cynicism that is also alive in this moment as well. And much of this comes from Fraser, as you said. This is a man who had purchased his own freedom as well as his wife's freedoms 10 years before. And when he meets with Stan and Sherman, this is what he says that freed people expect of freedom is some form of independence. And the best way to attain this independence is through the land. And what happens is when Sherman issues his Special Field Order 15, is that all of a sudden this effort to settle on land, this new demand for land reform, grafts onto the project at Port Royal. And so suddenly now Port Royal, amidst all the other things it has going on, whether it's the original plans for the project, dealing with the refugees, now all of a sudden it becomes the ground zero for this really extraordinary effort to help formerly enslaved people settle on requisitioned Confederate property. And it is a moment that succeeds to some extent. By the summer, I think the number that's usually cited is there's about 40,000 families settled on 400,000 acres of land, which is a substantial number. But as we know, that when Andrew Johnson succeeds Abraham Lincoln, he begins restoring former Confederates to their property, and enslaved people lose this land. And Sherman, who always viewed this as an expedient, right, and nothing more, nonetheless sort of let the genie out of the bottle, let land reform out of the bottle. And then because land reform fails with the story of Johnson, this has always been one of those sort of symbolic moments of the Civil War that really speaks to the unfulfilled promise of Reconstruction and the unfulfilled promise to Black America as well. And so, but the thing I just want to come back to is that when Fraser speaks to Sherman and Stanton in Savannah and talks about the need for land, they ask him at one point, where does he develop? Where does he get his opinions from? Like, how does he form these opinions? And he says, well, they're my own, but I also come to them by discussing and through my ministry, which I've sort of geared to the refugees, right? So these opinions have come from my many talks with the refugees themselves, which I find to be an incredible moment because it's a kind of clear example of connecting the dots of how these refugees, these otherwise faceless and forgotten characters in history, nonetheless, through the sheer collective power of their movements, were able to influence and have a direct effect on someone like Sherman and like Stanton. And so despite not actually being in the room, the refugees, by following the army, by coming to Savannah, nonetheless, really have a say-so in how history unfolds, which is a really kind of powerful idea if you think about it, and one that I've always been astounded by.
It's a fascinating story. I mean, it's that undercurrent of the march that I think people may know, but I don't think they really appreciate.
I don't think they study it that way, and that's I think a way that we need to study it in addition to the military, but that is a huge thing.
But to think about it, and even today, Ben goes a point. Think about today's thing. January 65, there are 17,000 refugees arriving in Port Royal. There's already 15,000 there. And so you have an overpopulation, which is going to destabilize the whole area, again, because of the march. And when Sherman continues his march, he keeps moving, his right wing is going to cross nearby Beaufort, South Carolina, and commanded by guess who, Mary? Oliver Otis Howard, Army of Tennessee. And according to one Bennett Parton, he describes Howard as a warm man with gentle eyes. Good Lord, Bennett, my God!
I like that description.
Anyway, that's how he describes it. But he's an abolitionist from Maine who basically fit right in with these Gideonites working on the islands again. And you can imagine the partnership that Rufus Saxon's going to have with Oliver Otis Howard. I mean, they did we just become best friends? That's kind of how they were. And they certainly did. They respected each other and vice versa. Howard learned a lot at Port Royal, and he really enjoyed the aspect of the schools. And it's important when you read Howard stuff, as he tours the island, he talks about how he sat as he heard the children, these black children singing songs, learning to read. Howard was big on education, and he especially loved the idea of these black children being educated. And his experience at Port Royal was probably a true revelation or epiphany and a huge step moving forward from a guy who was probably an a capital A abolitionist to a man who's going to become a champion of civil rights going forward. Howard spent a lot of time on the island touring the schools, and he even demanded Edward Stanton to come down and see this stuff. The unfortunate aspect of the army was the army was on the island too, and you have a lot of these men who did not like the African Americans, and it led to a lot of friction between the freed people and the soldiers on the island, which in some cases led to a couple of deaths here and there. But what was going on with that? Some soldiers laughed at the freed people, laughed at the Gideonites, the work they were doing. But this is why Rufus Saxon was sent there in the first place, was to control the military and help set up this community. But Howard's experience at Port Royal, it stayed with him. And long after he and his army moved to North Carolina, it absolutely did. He's going to pledge his support to Rufus Saxon. He's going to endorse him for the new Secretary of Treasury, a guy named William Fessenden, who's also went to Bowdoin, by the way, Mary, if you know that.
Nice.
He's basically saying Saxon is the best choice for their freedom. And he asked Fessenden, whatever you do not oppose him in his work on this island. And what's going on at the same time? What are they trying to pass in Congress around the same time? It's the 13th Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. And this is all going on. And they proposed a bureau to help the freedmen prepare for citizenship. It's officially called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. But what does everybody know it as?
The Freedmen's Bureau.
And guess who's going to be picked to lead it?
Howard.
Oliver Otis Howard. I want to just give you a chance to mention Howard, Mary. That's what I'm here for, right? But again, what's their focus? Again, it's on land reform. Thanks to Sherman and Stanton's, and it's really Stanton's Order 15, by the way. I know the Sherman people like it, but really a Stanton really was pulling the triggers, especially Order 15. But this is what's going on with this. This is kind of the new reconstruction now of how this is going to go. And we've talked a little bit before about what Johnson does. Or he doesn't do it, really.
Yeah. Johnson's a real scalawag in the story. I mean, not to use that term, and I mean, he's a real scoundrel. I mean, he is someone who is going to take a much more conservative view of what Reconstruction can be. And by the summer and certainly by the early fall of 1865, he is restoring this land to ex-Confederates. He views land restoration as part of the pardoning process and as part of Reconstruction. And this is going to lead to really tragic stories of freed people being placed on land only to then lose the land. And it's going to lead to, eventually in time, the kind of end of the refugee movement of Sherman's March, because many of the refugees were people who did not have kind of longstanding claims to some of the land there on the Sea Islands. They are going to be some of the ones that are pushed off the land first. And so many of the refugees who had followed Sherman's army, in some cases, some of the sources I found were from as far as Chattanooga, are going to be on the islands and then forced to make essentially another long walk, another long journey back into Georgia. And that is kind of where the refugee story of Sherman's March ends. And it is prompted by this ongoing process of land restoration that is put in place by Johnson, who is really the scoundrel. And he's someone who has real power in this moment because Congress is out of session. And so he is really sort of taking charge of what Reconstruction is going to look like as of when he comes into power in April of 1865 through the summer and through the early fall. And he's going to fight Congress tooth and nail on the creation or on the reauthorization of things like the Freedmen's Bureau. But I think Howard's experience on the islands, as both of you all mentioned, is hugely important. I mean, I never found any sort of smoking gun evidence to say that he imagined the Freedmen's Bureau as looking like what he saw on Port Royal. But I think just inference alone says that when he was there touring the schools, seeing the work that was already in place, that he in his mind likely saw the kind of blueprint for what the Freedmen's Bureau is going to look like. And this kind of feeds, and is another point that I like to raise, which is that in the aftermath of Sherman's March, there are so many things that coalesce, whether it be land reform, Howard's space on the island, and other things that lead to Sherman's March being kind of an early battle of Reconstruction. Is something that certainly set the stage for the kind of questions of Reconstruction that were going to take place very early on in the post-war years. And so in that sense, I think we can see the march as being both a Civil War campaign, but also a really early story in the history of Reconstruction.
I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, so Sherman's march forced the country to deal with Reconstruction probably sooner than they wanted to. I think they realized that they had to do it. I mean, you mentioned before the story of Johnson pardoning the Confederates, letting them get their land back. He makes Howard himself go back to South Carolina and tell the people they got to lose their land. It's just such a bad story. And they tried to do whatever they could to stall it. I mean, Stanton with Howard and Saxon did try to delay it a little bit, but it wasn't going to happen. And again, you ultimately see Johnson trying to, end the Freedmen's Bureau completely. It gets passed by Congress. It runs out of financing. They pass it. He vetoes it. They have to override the veto. It finally gets done. Johnson sees it as too expensive. He says it's an infringement of states' rights. And I mean, you can see why, where it's going with this. But again, Johnson gave the army the power to remove people off the land. And this is unfortunately a huge aspect of it all. He said free people could still buy the land, but they cut the max they could buy to 20 acres. They really watered it down to make it almost unsustainable. But to your point, this was the death knell for that land ownership program that really proved the government just didn't have the stones for real reform in early 1865. And unfortunately, that's just the way it was. And you mentioned before, for those former displaced, those former slaves at Port Royal, their only recourse is to literally walk home empty-handed back to Georgia, the land they walked away from years before. And just imagine, after risking their lives, gambling everything to march with Sherman's army, simply to pursue their day of jubilee, to watch it all fall apart in their face because of politics. It's really sad. It's a real dark aspect of American history that I think a light needs to be shined on. Your book does a great job doing that, no question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a real unsettling ending. I mean, that's one of the things that I struggled with this book so much, is the kind of conflicting emotions of trying to write something like this, and then also where to end this book. And the reality is, the only way I felt like I could end it was as I think it took place, which is in this very ambiguous and unfulfilled and unsatisfying ending of having the refugees return home, and also knowing that all of these sort of dreams remained entirely unfulfilled. And to your point, Darren, I would just say that this is there was no stomach for land reform, and that's true. But it also isn't true in the sense that in 1862, the same Congress that passes all of the confiscation acts, the same Congress is going to pass the Homestead Act, right? That's going to essentially be land reform in the West, right? So this is, land reform of this scale is not something that is unimaginable in the scope of U.S. history, especially in the scope of this Congress. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. But this is a scheme and a system, right, that is part of American politics in this moment. It didn't happen for the freed people. But absolutely, it's a sad story. It's a tragic story. It takes a really dark turn here at the end.
It's one that, I think, as I said at the beginning, this is like a different telling of the march in a way that I've never heard it told before, and it needed to be told. And it is like, yes, there's, like any history, there's jubilation in it, as you say, but there's also the dark parts as well. And those dark parts need to be talked about more. And I know Darren and I both really appreciated that, you talk about Ebenezer Creek, but you also talk that there's incidences before that as well, that Ebenezer Creek is not the only one. There's other ones that this is like a pattern with General Jefferson C. Davis as well. And I think that's really important to talk about, is this was something that was happening a lot. And it's like an excellent book, and one we both really enjoyed reading.
Yeah. So the book, again, is right here. It's called Somewhere Towards Freedom, Sherman's March to the Story of America's Largest Emancipation, by, of course, Bennett Parton, who's sitting right here. So real quick, I'm going to plug you real quick, Bennett. You'll be speaking about your new book, the National Civil War Museum, at 5:30 on Monday, January 27th. It's free. So if you're in the area, go check it out. Go see Mary Beth. Go see the gang over there. We'll probably try to come by and go see it. So if not, certainly please try to buy the book. I promise you'll enjoy it. And like you said, Mary, it's a much different look at Sherman's March to the Sea at a much more personal level. And like when you study history, the real history is the stories. right? You can study Sherman, you can study Davis, and all those people, but it's the true stories in understanding that grassroots looking down up to tell the real story. And this tells the story. And this does. You read this, you'll understand it. It's uncomfortable at times, but that's good. History should make you uncomfortable, and I think that's an important part of this thing. So, Bennett, can't thank you enough for joining us. I think this was a great discussion. I think it's like I said, it's good work you're doing, and I think it's going to be when this book comes out on the 21st. I think you're gonna have a lot of props on it.
Well, that's very nice. Y'all both have been very kind, and I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a blast. Hope we'll do it again sometime.
Yes, definitely. Yes, yeah. This was really really awesome discussion.
Somewhere towards freedom, part 2, the search for Curly's gold. We'll have you on. I promise you. We absolutely will. Definitely stay in touch. All right. So Mary, any final words? Actually, what's coming up for us next?
Next we will be talking about Battle of Roanoke, and then we have to decide on some other episodes to do. So. Ben, thank you for joining us tonight. Darren, thank you for being the awesome co-host that you are. And to our listeners, Happy New Year. And we will see you all again in a couple of weeks.
I have to say this too. Go Ohio State. Oh, I hate Notre Dame. Do you realize, Ben, what your Georgia team did to me, forcing me to have to? God, don't get it.
We could go another 2 hours on this. I got a lot of thoughts. And I don't know who to root for in this upcoming game. I mean, geez, it's both. It's not good. It's not good.
It's gonna be a tough one. We'll all get through it together. I promise, one way or the other. So again, Ben, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Thanks, Mary. We appreciate it as well. We'll talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all later, listeners. Bye.
Peace out.